I'm Alan Beck. I'm the Senior Statistical Advisor at the Bureau of Justice Statistics. We're an agency within the U.S. Department of Justice. Our role, most recently, has been to implement the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which requires the Bureau to conduct surveys in prisons and jails and juvenile facilities, to rank facilities based on those surveys, and to identify facilities with the highest rates of sexual victimization and the lowest rates of sexual victimization. The requirement is a very challenging one for us as an agency, in that we have to conduct very large-scale surveys. So in the course of our last 10 years, we've conducted about 250,000 survey interviews of inmates in prisons, in jails, juvenile facilities, and former inmates. So it is quite demanding on basic methodologies so as to get accurate estimates of the prevalence and incidence of sexual victimization. Unlike many of our statistical series, this series has great consequences for the actual facilities in which we're in. So we have to take particular care to ensure that the methodologies are appropriate and are accurate, because there are real consequences for the facility should they come out high. We've been conducting these surveys ever since the Act passed. And let me explain a bit about what first we had to do, is we had to actually define what it is that sexual victimization was, and then ultimately how to measure that. The sexual victimization is a very broad concept, in fact, sexual violence that involves all forms and aspects of unwanted, unwilling sexual activity between inmates, and any kind of sexual activity between inmates and staff. The concept is fairly diverse. There are low aspects, that is, unwanted grabbing, groping, touching, that doesn't involve much injury, much coercion. And then there are very high-end aspects of sexual victimization that involve things that we typically associate with rape. So we needed to develop measures in order to provide the ultimate ranking of facilities. We used this particular methodology called audio-computer assisted self-interviewing. The reason we did that was that this methodology, which involves a computer-assisted self-interview with a synchronized audio feed, in which inmates actually conduct a survey themselves, the reason we did that is it takes the social context out of the interview process. And particularly when you're talking to men about being raped, that's a very sensitive thing and not likely to be reported, particularly so to a female interviewer. So we had to eliminate the social dynamic, the social interaction. We also had to protect our staff from knowledge of the information, because should they hear about a rape or a sexual assault, there in some states would be mandated to report it. And if we had to report the identity of the person reporting it to us, they would not report it to us. So we had to keep a certain level of confidentiality as to elicit a response that they ordinarily probably wouldn't respond to. So the survey itself is an audio-computer assisted self-interview. Now, it's a random sample of facilities, very large scale. There are about 7,600 facilities covered by the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And we're required to be in 10% of such facilities each and every year. Now, we can't meet that mandate, but we are in a large volume of facilities on a recurring basis. The last time we conducted the survey was in 2011, 2012. We were in over 230 state prisons, roughly 350 local jails, and about 325 state-operated juvenile facilities. So we conduct a random probability sample of facilities based on proportion to size. Within facilities, we randomly select individuals for the survey. We ask the officials to bring the inmates or the youth to a site that's secure, that they can't be observed. Their answers cannot be learned from through observation. We randomize the survey so as a certain fraction of the respondents actually get a different survey to, again, protect anonymity of the respondents. And so overall, we get a relatively high response rate that is about 60% response rate nationwide within facilities. Some portion of those that we don't have a response, we can't get to, are persons who are perhaps cognitively unable to do the survey or are otherwise too difficult to bring forth to be interviewed. We use multiple measures, very explicit measures of sexual victimization. So we separate out the coercion from the actual activity itself, and we get a whole array of continuum of measures of coercion, all the way from, when it comes to staff, all the way from willing activity that can't be consensual because inmates can't consent, to forcible use of a weapon by the staff to actually commit the sexual abuse. When it comes to inmate on inmate, it's all unwanted, unwilling, and it involves various forms of coercion, bribery, all the way through force and threat of force. And so we conduct these surveys. Of course, there are many challenges in actually completing the surveys in this scale, but we've published extensively based on those surveys to look at the incidence and prevalence of sexual victimization. So the basic results have been that about 4% of state and federal inmates report having been sexually victimized within the last 12 months or since coming to the facility, whichever is shorter. And unfortunately, about 10% of the youth are reporting such sexual victimization in the last 12 months or since coming to the facility, whichever is shorter. We have learned that when it comes to staff sexual misconduct, it's largely cross-gender. That is, largely when it comes to youth, boys with female staff. When it comes to prisons and jails, it involves male inmates with female staff as well. Female staff are overrepresented by about a factor of 2 among the perpetrators of sexual victimization. When it comes to inmate on inmate or youth on youth, girls and women are overrepresented among the victims. That is, women are much more likely to be victimized by another woman than are males to report being victimized by another male inmate. We find very much risk factors related to sexual victimization. One of the very important risk factors is sexual orientation and gender identity. Those who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender have very high rates of sexual victimization. Persons who have some mental, emotional problems have very high rates relative to those who do not. Some correlation related to being a sex offender. Sex offenders, those serving time for sex offenders, are also more likely to be victimized than those who are not serving such time. So we find a whole series of covariates related to sexual victimization. We also look at facility level covariation to look at the kinds of facilities that have higher rates of sexual victimization than other types of facilities. And so we learn a great deal about the nature of sexual victimization, both as individual risk factors as well as facility level characteristics. This has had a profound impact on policy and correctional policies in the United States. We've had a promulgation of standards for facilities to meet, and going through a process of certification of those facilities through audit processes to ensure that those standards are being met. It is a voluntary program, but subject to many risks if a facility does not choose to adopt those standards, particularly with respect to a reduction in federal funding for prisons and correctional functions. And then there's, moreover, a significant civil liability that should a facility not adopt the standards and have an incident of sexual victimization, they can face significant financial liability. So there's a direct link between the data that we collect the ranking of the facilities, the identification of high-rate facilities, and the policies of, within corrections.